I'd like to say a few words about my teaching and research interests. My teaching interests included psychological anthropology, anthropology of religion, anthropological aesthetics, Japanese culture, medical anthropology, and methodology. My main goal of teaching was to stimulate creative and critical thinking. And my main goal in research was to understand what is really going on with the people I am studying, which really means that one's methodology must be adjusted to the topic at hand. You can't use one methodology for studying biology and astronomy and people and religious rituals. The methodologies really have to vary, and so I did a lot of experimentation with that. I mentioned earlier that while at the University of Alberta, I started the Center for the Cross-Cultural Study of Health and Healing. And the mandate of that center was to document and help preserve indigenous medical knowledge and healing rituals, and to facilitate the cooperation between indigenous healing practices and modern medicine. So in connection with that mandate, I started working with Russell and Yvonne Willier. Russell Willier is a Cree healer from northern Alberta, the Sucker Creek Reserve. I actually started working with him documenting his traditional skin tanning practices, but after videotaping him and his wife skin tanning with moose brains, after about a week I discovered that he was a shaman. And so I was more interested in shamanism than I was in skin tanning. So I asked him, I said, would you consider me and my crew doing a study of your shamanism? And he said, well, you'd have to think about that. So he meditated and prayed in the forest for a couple of days and eventually came back and said he was agreeable to doing it. He said he knew it would be controversial, but he thought it was important to document native healing practices in the belief that native healing is scientific in its own way, and that if we could film this and document in black and white the power of native healing, this would be useful, particularly in helping preserve native medicine for the future, and maybe helping attract native young people to become healers. So that's led to the psoriasis research project, where we picked 10 non-native patients with psoriasis. We chose psoriasis because it's a scaly skin disease, which is easy to see, and you can see if there's any progress in the healing. So we started off in Edmonton in the basement of the Boyle Macaulay Clinic with the doctors and nurses observing, and Russell treated these patients with herbal medicines and rituals. And then we moved to our acreage home, where Russell built a sweat lodge, and we did more traditional sweat lodge ceremonies and until the end of the project. One patient was completely healed. The other 9 made considerable progress, but they weren't completely healed. They were happy with the results, but Russell Willier was not. He said, if I do any more of this in the future, people will have to come to the reserve, and we will do it very intensive, where I will give them medicines every 5 hours around the clock, because the way it is, I'm not sure people are actually applying the medicine because it smelled terrible. And I know a couple of the patients were sent home from work, they told to go home and take a shower. They said if they come up there, I can make sure the treatment is done properly. And so that's what we did. We ended up with some patients going up there. and with dramatic results. The results were much stronger. I also edited a book called Healthcare Issues in the Canadian North. This book here, and in which I and other people talked about our experiences with healthcare issues in the North. I and two graduate students did a book called Cry of the Eagle, Encounters with the Cree Healer. This is the results of working with Russell Willier for 5 years. And we did dozens of interviews, and we made transcripts from those, took part in a variety of ceremonies, went on expeditions to collect herbs and this sort of thing. This book was very controversial at the time. Well, at least there was one chapter that was very controversial. We had a chapter in here on the medicines that Russell used, and we decided we had to take it out because it was causing too much trouble. So we took it out. And it wasn't until 2010 that Russell and I got together again with an ethnobotanist to redo that chapter on his medicine bundle and the herbs that he uses. So last year we came out with this book, this is doing very well, A Cree Healer and His Medicine Bundle. And in this book we have photographs of all the plants and how they are used. And the ethnobotanist contributed a lot of valuable information on why these plants work. In other words, looking at their their chemical properties and why they work. Russell Willier himself has sold over 100 of these copies to local Indian bands, which they're using in classes. This shows how times have changed. So when I first started working with Russell, not only was it controversial in the Native community, but the Dean of Medicine at the University of Alberta called me in and wanted to know why I was using good university money to study witchcraft. And in the meantime, between then and now, things really have changed. Clifford Cardinal, a Cree healer, has been hired at the Center for the Cross-Cultural Study of Health and Healing. It's now in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta, and he teaches medical students about his practices, and he's in charge of making sure that traditional practices and medicines are documented for the future. A few years ago, the center sponsored a gathering of Native healers. They came from all over Canada, and they had a lot of discussion, and the majority of them believe that now is the time that these things have to be written down before any more elders die. And so much more progressive attitude, and I often had doctors, when I would show slides of my research with Willier at the medical school, ask me if they could refer patients to Russell. And I would have to say, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that, because sweat lodge ceremonies only 10 or 12 people can attend, and you have to go to the reserve and be prepared to stay 2 or 3 days and so forth. It's too complicated. Nevertheless, a lot of the doctors finally started to take Native medicine seriously, particularly when they looked at before and after photos, which I'll make available so you can see a couple of those examples. One book resulting from that work at the center, I don't think I have a copy of it here, was called The Involvement of Canadian Native Communities in Their Healthcare Programs. This was a Canada Council grant to document the transfer of health which was happening to many reserves, how that was going. And so we talked to a number of people and wrote that up in a book. Also did some work in Cuba in connection with a PhD student, Tracy Spack. She had gone to Cuba to study traditional medicine, and she found that due to the economic embargo by the U.S., the Cubans were not able to buy modern medicines, modern drugs, and so they reverted to using traditional medicines, many of them actually coming from Africa, and combining them with the modern drugs they could get. They started seriously exploring how to make their own drugs, and Cuba today is in the front ranks of some of the most outstanding work in creation of new drugs. She found that the Cubans really liked this combined approach, where the traditional herbal medicines were combined with modern medicine. And so I talked, my wife and I visited her in Havana. We stayed with a Cuban family in Havana for a couple of weeks. During that time, I talked with a variety of government officials about the program and what needed to be done. That resulted in a book put together by Tracy Spack on the traditional medicine of Cuba. And I got a grant to get this published. And so we published this and distributed many copies to schools, medical schools in Cuba, because they didn't have money really to buy their own books. That was followed by a trip to Sierra Leone with my wife to visit another PhD student who was studying traditional medicine in Sierra Leone. While I was there, a professor at the University of Sierra Leone cornered me, and he had a manuscript on the traditional medicines of Sierra Leone. And he asked me if I would take the manuscript back because he was afraid it would get lost because the Civil War was on in Sierra Leone. And I agreed to do that, and I found another grant, and we published this book. And this was edited and improved by a professor at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And so we sent a number of these books to Sierra Leone. The first batch that we sent to the author, B.M.S. Touré, was destroyed. His house was burned down by the rebels, and all the books we had sent were destroyed. So we sent him another batch. Now, in addition to documenting native healing practices, I also documented native skin tanning, birch bark basket making, and mask carving. What I would do is to videotape the entire production process of a craftsman and analyze this into grammatical units, much as I had done with archaeological research working with Rob Bonnickson on trying to recover the production grammar behind the production of stone tools. So I applied the same methodology. And the goal was to produce sufficiently detailed information that the craft could be reconstructed if it died out in the future, which was a good move because birch bark basket making is practically gone now, at least in Alberta. And native skin tanning is also very few people doing it anymore because it doesn't pay. It's so time and work intensive and much cheaper to process skins using chemicals, factory methods. But we do have videotape programs on these crafts, and we collected examples which we gave to the University of Alberta. And this work was described in an article in Arctic Anthropology. And so we came up, this represents a type of grammar with the steps involved, the rules, and the options and the choices and the reasons why you would use one option as opposed to another. And so this is a good summary of that in this book. Okay, so I did that work in conjunction with Gertrude Nix, who is curator of anthropology at the Royal Museum of Anthropology, Ruth McConnell, who is with the Royal Alberta Museum, and Linda Suss, who was in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. So the main conclusion that I drew from my work with cognitive archaeology, working with the flintnapper and with endangered crafts, is that if one wants to understand material culture, it is important to understand the cognitive processes and behavior that lie behind the finished product. This is much more useful than just describing the finished product. This has predictive value as well, because, for example, with stone tools, if you understand the grammar behind the stone tools in an archaeological assemblage, you can be on the lookout for that same grammar in new sites and as a way of linking sites. So it gives you some idea of what to look for. Because although the shape and the size may vary, that doesn't really tell you very much. You look at the production grammar, which can be recovered from studying in detail the sequencing of flake scars, which are still visible. Also, this type of detailed approach is useful because it does provide enough information that people in the future, if they understand the grammar involved, can reinvent these crafts, which I think is actually going to happen. A little bit what I learned from working with native healers. One thing I learned is, and this has got me in trouble for saying this at an anthropology conference, but I learned that under the right conditions, it is possible for mental imagery to be transferred unconsciously from one person to another, even to someone who is new to the culture. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples of this. The Lakota healer I am supervising right now, a number of years ago, led me through the Vision Quest, which involves 4 days and 4 nights sitting in the forest without any food or water and repeating that for 4 years, which is the toughest thing I've ever done in my life. That was really tough. But every morning, he would come around and ask, well, did you have any visions last night? Well, I did have quite a few visions. But on this one particular morning, I said, well, yeah, I had a dream, I had a vision, but I don't think it was very important. I don't think you'd be interested in it. And he said, well, go ahead and tell me anyway. So I started to describe how I had seen this big body of water, and there was a log floating, and a muskrat or a beaver, I couldn't tell which, came up with mud and deposited on top of the log, and he kept building it up, and his mouth flew open. He says, that's our Lakota creation myth. He says, I've been hoping all my life to have that vision, and you say it's not important. Well, where did that come from? I didn't know anything about that myth. Well, I think it was transferred directly from his mind to my mind, because I was in an appropriate cultural circumstances and the right mental attitude where that kind of transfer could take place. To give you another example, which is also interesting, my wife and I were invited to a shaking tent ceremony. In the old days, shaking tents took place in a teepee. They would tie the shaman up with blankets and ropes, and inside the teepee they had sharpened stakes, which they drove into the ground, all these sharp stakes sticking up. And they would tie him up and put him in on top of those stakes and close the door. After a while, the tent would start to shake, which is where it would get its name. The blankets and ropes would come flying out, and the shaman would come out unscathed. Well, these days they don't do that anymore. They do it in a building. But they close all the windows and put blankets over them till it's dark inside, and they tie the shaman up like they did in the old days. and then a spirit will come in, or more than one spirit will come in, and the shaman will speak to them and ask for healing for people. And at the end of the ceremony, the shaman is off in a corner. He's out of his blankets. You wonder how he got there because it's so tightly packed it's impossible to move even. And rattles will fly around, sparking, all of this sort of thing. But anyway, the interesting part was that the night before we were to attend this shaking tent ceremony, my wife and I had dreams. I call them visions because the visions are dreams that are so clear and so vivid that you never forget them. Most dreams you forget, but a vision is so clear, and sometimes it can happen while you're lying there with your eyes open. You don't even have to be asleep. But that night before the ceremony, I dreamed of, I was out working and two cougars approached me. And they walked past me. They didn't harm me. My wife dreamed that she was being chased by a black bear. And she took refuge in a building and was not harmed either. Well, when we arrived at the house the next day for the ceremony, the ceremony was in the basement of this building, and there were two banners, one on each side of the stairs going downstairs. One side was a bear and the other side was a cougar. We thought, well, this is really interesting. So the spirit that came in that night was the turtle spirit, and talked in a different kind of voice. By the time the ceremony was over, we went home. It was after midnight, and our daughter had gone to bed, and so we went to bed. The next morning, we got up, started breakfast. She came up. She said, "I had the strangest dream last night." We said, "Well, why? What happened?" And she said, "Well, I was out riding my bicycle and I saw something in the ditch, and I stopped and went back, and it was a turtle." And she said, "And I've never seen a turtle in Alberta." And so we then told her about the turtle spirit that had come in. And I had many experiences like this, working with Native people. But the circumstances have to be right, because after I stopped this intensive field work, I never had any of those experiences again. Never happened. But I was discussing some of this at a conference. It was actually, I think it might have been in Montreal. And a prominent anthropologist got up and said it was all nonsense, and the anthropologist shouldn't be dabbling in psychic phenomena, and he stomped out of the room. And so not a very popular topic among some anthropologists, but it was convincing to me. I had enough of these experiences that I really do believe that under the right circumstances, imagery can be passed from one person to another. I think the other thing I learned from working with Native healers, it helped me expand my own worldview. I was trained as a scientist with strong emphasis on methodology and normal scientific worldview, and I found working with Native people, this didn't work. You had to give up preconceptions about what science actually is. And I came to the conclusion that Native knowledge is based upon science as well. It's a different kind of science. But for example, if you want to catch fish, you have to know something about the speed of the water and how cold the water is, what time of year, and so forth. Natives don't survive in an environment without knowing a lot about having concrete knowledge about the environment as a result of experimentation over thousands of years. And so I think Native knowledge really is science. So I had to really adjust my thinking about what science is, and I think it helped consolidate my belief that methodology really has to be appropriate to what you're studying, which I mentioned earlier. Okay. Now, in addition to working with Native people, I also went to China 3 times to study the interaction of traditional Chinese medicine and Western medicine. I went to hospitals in Beijing, went to Heilongjiang, the capital of, I went to the capital there of Harbin, and talked to professors there, and then went to Inner Mongolia to take a look at Mongolian medicine. And I found this very interesting because I found that most Chinese preferred what they call a combination approach. A lot of Chinese hospitals have three divisions. They have a division of modern medicine, they have a division of traditional Chinese medicine, and they have a division of combination medicine. Most Chinese, if they can get in, prefer to go to the combination. For example, I interviewed one man who was losing his toes due to gangrene from sugar diabetes, and they tried conventional Western medicine first, and it didn't help, so then they applied herbal medicine, and that stopped. It didn't restore his toes that had decayed, but it stopped it from progressing any further. So what happens is that they'll have a team of Chinese doctors, Western-style doctors, traditional doctors, and they all sit around a table and discuss a case and decide on the procedure and what to do next. And an example of the combined approach is cancer patients, they may be given radiation therapy, for example, and then herbal therapy to reduce the effects of the radiation, which seem to be quite helpful. Comparing Aboriginal and traditional Chinese medicine, I found that both are holistic. Both emphasize the necessity for balancing body, mind, and spirit, and both are based upon natural medicines. The main difference is that native medicine is as much religion as it is medicine, whereas traditional Chinese medicine focuses more upon healing than upon religion. Otherwise, there are many similarities.